Chapter 23, Mundane Readjustment. I was trying to open my eyes, the lids of which had grown stiff and unyielding, trying to adjust myself, in a case which seemed to have shrunken, trying to move hands that had grown heavy beyond my ability to lift. Mian and other spirits were hovering about me. I could feel the electrified essence, which had manifested its presence everywhere during my voyaging, drawing itself away, letting me go, as it were. Then, the burden of physical life was full upon me, and what a misfit I was. I felt as though I had been crammed into something several sizes too small for me. The heat within was awful, while the exterior was cold and as heavy as lead. While laboring in this agony of readjustment, the nurse raised up, rubbing her eyes, with an expression of guiltiness on her face for having overslept.
"My, how I have slept,"
she was saying.
"all night without waking. When have I done such a thing?"
Then she looked at me, as though she had just thought of me, and asked, trying to prune her voice to professional cadence.
"How are you this morning?"
"Very well, thank you," I managed to mumble, as my benumbed tongue obeyed reluctantly the demand made upon it. Had she been less sleepy, I am sure she would have noted the unusual sound of my voice, which was quaky and scarcely audible. Instead, she yawned violently, drew herself up, got out of bed and went into the bathroom, leaving me thankful for the opportunity of further readjustment and examination of my exact physical status, after existing for so long entirely independent of the body. While she made her toilet, I took the inventory. The fingernails were blue as though bruised. As I was unable to raise myself, I could not see my toenails, but fancied that they were in the same condition and pushed them under the edge of the sheet, and shut my hands so she could not see them, and turned my face where it would be in shadow, all the time wondering how it looked. When I shut my hands, I could not feel the nails on the palms and, altogether, there was such an unnatural feeling, that I began investigating and, of all disconcerting things, it was the discovery that my body was insensible. How awesome was the thought of being a living soul in a dead body. I pinched myself, easily at first, then as vigorously as my limited strength would permit. This having no effect, I took a hairpin, from where I had put it the night before, when I loosened my hair, and with it pricked my arms, then my body through the thin gown, but there was no more sensation than if I had been pricking the bed. It was terrible, and I heard the nurse coming and closed my eyes. She came very near and, after looking at me critically for a moment, remarked,
"Not eating is certainly telling on you."
Then it all came back, this sickening tragedy that seemed a thing of some other cycle of time. So much had happened since it had tortured me, and I had no time nor patience for it now, as the dead condition of my body was consuming all of my consideration. It was then, when the very thought of eating was most hateful to me, that breakfast was brought in, arranged in the daintiest and most tempting manner. I could have screamed at the sight of it, but restraining myself, I smiled and said pleasantly, "I don't care for anything this morning, thank you." After the tray had been taken away, and the nurse's arguments over with, I again settled down to the perplexing problem confronting me. What ought I to do? After deliberating for a long time, I called to the nurse. "Will you please bring my rubber flesh brush from the bathroom?" When she returned with it, I said, by way of explanation, "Thank you, my flesh seems so dead." She looked at me disapprovingly and turned away without a word, as I began rubbing vigorously, without producing the slightest effect. With the determination of making myself feel, I summed up all the strength I could and attacked my arm, just below the elbow, with a strenuousness that I did not realize, until I felt the rubber working easily as though on damp flesh, and looked at the arm to discover that the skin was removed, and the blood oozing out, dampening the rubber. There was something sickening about it, so much so, that my hands fell weak and helpless by my sides, and the rubber rolled off on the floor. The nurse came over and picked it up, and then brought a towel dipped in perfumed ice water and rubbed my face, which no doubt would have been refreshing, if I could have felt it. I kept my arm in a position that hid the wound, shrinking from a questioning to which there was no satisfactory answer. Then I realized that worrying was not helping me, so what was the use of worrying? Plato tells us, nothing in human affairs is worth any great anxiety, and his philosophy is still our greatest exposition of idealism in a speculative way. So I dismissed, or rather crowded out thoughts of my body, by reviewing the occurrences of the night before and tried to formulate in my mind a working basis of all things being one, being interpenetrated by that wonderful magnetic or electrical current, invisible, silent, powerful. Finally, the illustration that most appealed to me was likening it to an electric powerhouse, to which we are as the lights in the different parts of the city, each with its own scope of illumination, a power that can be turned on or off at will. Connected, it illuminates our own pathway and those of others. If turned off, we grope as blind creatures, crying out in the darkness. But we cannot get away from this silent invisible power. It is always there, to be used or abused as we elect. How wonderful it all was, and yet I dared not even hint it to anyone, despite the fact that we have reached that stage of progression, where we recognize nothing as impossible, using everyday commonplace things, which were once high among recognized impossibilities. Suppose, for instance, someone had told our forefathers, as they rubbed stones together to produce a light, that the time would come when, by touching a tiny button, a whole building, or city, would be lighted up instantly, that a man could sit in Washington and press a button that would light up a skyscraper in New York, or anywhere else on this continent, and that in future, the same could be done anywhere in the world. When they were killing their horses riding in mad haste to deliver messages, suppose someone had suggested that the time would be when a message could circle the globe, before they could saddle the horse. Could they then have believed that a person could sit in one city and converse with another, miles away? Could they foresee the wonders of wireless telegraphy, and that the same principle will, in time, be applied to telephony? Take moving pictures for instance. Suppose some misguided wretch had suggested years ago that anyone could play in New York and be seen by the whole world, further, that the player dying would make no difference. He or she could play on, and could be seen after death just the same as before. Similarly, in the case of a phonograph record, it is not altered in the least by the death of the singer. Technically, we hear the dead sing, see the dead play, but there is nothing supernatural about it. It is that great silent invisible force, electricity, demonstrating its power on Earth, as it does in the invisible spheres. We have made all these wonderful things common by everyday use, and so we will go ever onward, filling the wonders of today with the commonplaces of tomorrow, and there are many wonders still unborn, greater even than we dream. Spirit communication is one of the wonders of today that tomorrow will claim for its commonplaces, when we will converse with the so-called dead, as easily as we now do with the living, communicate with other realms, as we now do other cities, visit the invisible worlds, leaving our physical bodies at home, just as we now do our other material possessions. Really, spirit communication is nothing new. It is as old as the records of the world. All religion is based on it. Without it there would be no religious foundation, nothing on which to hang the theory of life after death. While conscious continuity of life has been admitted down through the ages, evidence of it has always been shrouded in mystery and uncertainty, a glaring inconsistency, but the time is now upon us, when it refuses to be denied any longer and insists on taking its place in the foremost ranks of demonstrated facts. It is a demonstrated fact, admitted by the greatest scientists and thinkers of the world, who see the handwriting on the wall, that all who will, may read and understand. The history of spirit communion is rather diversified, as each age had treated it in its own way, whether right or wrong. In biblical times, those who communed with spirits were sacred, the chosen of God. In later days, they were burned at the stake as witches, heretics, and worse. Still later, they were incarcerated within asylums for the insane, but now it has met us at Philippi. We stand face to face with it, with no choice but acceptance, and still later, in the future, it will revolutionize the world. There will be peace, one nation, one religion, and we will wonder how it could ever have been otherwise. However, there is a price, a mighty toll, to be paid before this ideal condition prevails. How I digress. I could not chain my thoughts to earth that day. They would soar away, and I seemed to live in that faraway world, away from the earth and all of its sordidness, but when the lunch hour came, it dragged me down again to that everlasting eating tragedy, the war of the seen and unseen, over a soul that belonged to neither and yet to both, one exacting a fast, the other a feast. The nurse had reached the limit of her patience, and a few minutes later I heard her phoning the doctor, admitting her inability to cope with such contrariness. About the middle of the afternoon the doctor came, and, after exhausting his power of persuasion, delivered the following ultimatum.
You will either eat, or be sent where the operation will be performed under compulsory conditions.
I flinched under such a lash, but made no appeal. After he had gone, however, I cried pleadingly to the forces that held me, cried out into the invisible void, "Be merciful," but no answering voice came back, and I knew that, until I was released, the fast would prevail regardless of consequences. But was there such a place, where people could be made to eat whether they wanted to or not? Was he trying to frighten me into compliance? I asked myself lots of questions and was very unhappy for a while, and then utterly weary of the tragedy of it all, of watching preparations go forward in accordance with the doctor's ultimatum, of the bitterness of it all. I turned my face to the wall. Tears that hurt, as they moistened the dry benumbed lids, came sparingly as though the parched lids absorbed them, before they could escape. Then a peace came upon me. I did not care, nothing mattered. No matter how the tide ebbed, I would just drift with it in utter disregard. I would make no appeal where either world was concerned, they could do with me as they liked. Suddenly I realized that I was exceedingly hungry and thirsty, and there was a stinging sensation in the throat. It needed no one to tell me that I had been released. I knew it before I heard the voice saying,
"Eat, drink."
Now that the fasting pressure was lifted, a strange regret, almost apprehensive, came upon me, and I was wondering if the spiritual privileges had been entirely withdrawn, and I had been unreservedly given back to the physical. Though hungry and thirsty, I remained for some time as I was, loath to dissipate a condition that had played its part in the transitional drama of the night before, the memory of which seemed even more beautiful than the reality. I had wanted to come back to earth, but now was I altogether satisfied that I had done so? A special dinner was prepared that evening, and served with as much ceremony as though in reality it celebrated my return from the report of missing men, all of which I appreciated more than I dared express, feigning in indifference the absence of frankness enforced. However, I ate very sparingly, as some way, I was not really hungry when the time came, but it satisfied those interested, and that was much. At last, the long day, with its mundane and supermundane exactions, was over, and I was alone in the night watches again, wondering if I had been given back unreservedly to the mundane, and was almost afraid to call into the silence, lest I should find it void, a confirmation more terrible than suspense. As I waited in this awful uncertainty, I perceived Mian beside me, felt the great electrified current envelop me, and, before I fully realized what was transpiring, I was again riding on the vibratory waves of space. Chapter 24, Mundane and Supermundane Relationship. That which was profitable to the soul of man, the Father revealed to the ancients, that which is profitable to the soul of man today, revealeth he this day. Again I looked down upon my vacated body, but it was not nearly so interesting as it had been the night before, and after the most casual observation, I vibrated leisurely about within the environment of the earth, wondering what was forthcoming. For some time I waited for Mian to speak, but as he did not, I ventured. "Where are we going, Mian?"
Would you care to observe the earth in its actual relationship with the invisible?
Nothing would please me more, I assured him, feeling almost enthusiastic at the prospect.
Come.
He called, and we vibrated lower upon the face of the earth, where the vibrations became more pronounced, as we harmonized with its magnetism. I floated easily about over the city, taking what might be termed a physical inventory. I wanted to see if things looked the same, viewed from the other side of life. They did. Moonlight flooded the city with its softness, and I looked into the faces of the stars, feeling the witchery of the night's perfection much as I had always done. The automobiles, conveyances, pedestrians, were hurrying along just as usual. The buildings and everything looked just the same. The town clock was nearing the midnight hour. After looking into its familiar face a few seconds, I turned away and would have walked upon the sidewalk, that I might go into the buildings through their doors, but Mian entered easily through the wall, and, with just a little misgiving, I followed and learned that material constructions, or obstructions, formed no bar to my sight or passing. I was surprised that I had not thought of that before, as it seemed I must have known it. As otherwise, how could I have gone out, and come in, the night before? As the inhabitants lay wrapped in the oblivion of sleep, we passed into their homes, even unto the most sacred firesides, and stood aghast, as the doors of skeleton closets creaked on their rusty hinges, and strange ghosts walked out in full view, concealing nothing. Nothing could be concealed, as between souls there can be no deceptions. Those of us who spend our energies making deception and concealment fine arts, find in the end how worse than useless has been the expenditure of our energies. How strange it all seemed, as we violated home after home, passing through the halls of pleasure and the aisles of pain, until I began to feel ashamed of the unfair advantage I was taking of unsuspecting and defenseless humanity, and would have returned, but Mian spurred me to renewed activity by saying solemnly,
One must first procure knowledge before giving it. To serve humanity, one must know humanity.
And thus, using my purpose to excuse my act, I went on and on, suspended above or standing by the bedside of the sleeping, conversing with the soul that never sleeps. In fact, in some instances souls were entirely absent from the bodies as they slept, away somewhere. When I first observed that sleep is nothing more nor less than the soul leaving the body, for the higher pleasures and benefits of the spirit world, I was shocked, but soon became accustomed to seeing disembodied spirits, and spirits of the sleeping, mingling together in the friendliest and most natural manner. The household, or guardian spirits, in some homes, objected to our entry and we passed on, respecting the objection without question, as some spirits love the human beings over whom they keep watch, so devotedly, that they exclude from them all other spirit influence or interference. Such protection other spirits respect, as long as the human beings, thus guarded, make no objections, and as most persons are unconscious of invisible solicitude, they neither appreciate it nor object to it. In some instances it is all right, but in others it would be better to break the influence. However, this breaking up, or changing one's invisible household, is a very serious matter and should be undertaken only with discriminating intellectuality and spirituality, or, even more undesirable entities may enter into the vacancy created by the departure of those who must retire at the command of the one concerned. While the law of, like attracts like, is excellent, we must not lose sight of the fact that a chain is no stronger than its weakest link, and that we are no stronger than our weakest propensity. And good may ever conquer ill. Health walk where pain has trod. As a man thinketh, so he is. Arise and think with God. Varied were the emotions born within me, as I viewed uncovered souls and knew them as they knew themselves, in all their sin-laden weariness and sorrow-laden memories. Even the whitest and purest souls suffer because of fancied sins, even more than real criminals suffer for real crimes. Even little children sorrow deeply, as I saw little pillows damp with childish tears, that aching hearts had pumped to the surface. A soul as old as time, struggling with a new opportunity. Selfishness enthroned itself in many hearts, while the willing subjects held unto themselves the joy of self-love, which poisons while it pleases. There were blackened souls within handsome and beautiful bodies of men and women, souls too pure and white for earth's tragedies incorporated within weak, deformed and ugly bodies. Then there were beautiful souls within beautiful bodies, hideous souls within hideous bodies, and so it went on and on, the invisible influence ever in evidence. Some otherwise beautiful souls were held in unconscious bondage by invisible, earth-magnetized beings, whose influence was worse than degrading, even criminal. It is such influence that sometimes make criminals, after committing a most revolting crime, defend their actions by claiming that God, or some scion among the influential dead, told them to do it. They feel perfectly justified in what they have done, regardless of consequences to themselves, or anyone else. Such earth-magnetized spirits live, in a way, the physical life, at the expense of human beings, and, in some way, gather unto themselves strength beyond the average spirit, so much so that they can imitate the voice, or appearance, of any person they find it expedient to represent. They find some person of their own instincts and dominate him, and, when he is sufficiently sensitive for the purpose for which he has been trained, they appear to him, or speak assuming the appearance, or voice, of the person most effective in the accomplishment of their design. They assist in the accomplishment of crime, as well as in the apprehension of the criminal, rejoicing in the chain of misery they have the power to create, as well as to satisfy their craving to identify themselves with physical action. St. Paul warns us, "Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits whether they are of God." Reason was given us to use, therefore, we should put the searchlight of reason on everything, spiritual as well as material. No matter what comes from the invisible world, submit it to the highest pressure of reason before becoming identified with it, or acting in accordance with it. Spirits are only disembodied human beings, who take human frailties, and perversities, into the spirit world with them, some having a very hard time ridding themselves of them. We retain our identity absolutely, as we would not be ourselves if, by simply coming out of our physical bodies, we changed immediately into a soul much better or infinitely worse. What we are in this world, is what we will be when we wake up and find ourselves dead, and so we shall remain until, by our own spiritual strength, we evolve into the higher conditions of the afterlife. However, it is possible for us to so live while in the earth life, that we may pass unconsciously, through all eliminating conditions, and wake in what one might term the heaven world, a condition of extreme spiritual happiness. Very few go by way of this direct route. I cannot too strongly impress it upon the reader that there are no lost souls. The unfortunate creatures who go into the spirit world after abusing, through their own weakness, the privilege of earth life, fall out of the evolutionary vibrations for a time and become creatures of retrogression, instead of progression, but sooner or later, that ever onward irresistible current takes them within itself and unifies them with the great scheme of things. We may give this class our pity and our prayers, but we must shut them out of communion with us, until we have attained soul strength sufficient to uplift them, instead of being degraded by them. In fact, they are very good things to leave alone entirely, until we are quite sure of ourselves. We must learn to know that nothing can make us evil, or commit criminal acts against our wills, nothing can really hurt us, but ourselves. There is a still small voice within, which we call a conscience, and which never fails. When in doubt, we should just listen to it. Listening, we cannot act wrong and feel happy in so doing. So I floated on and on over the sleeping city, listening and learning, earth life an open book before me. I floated through the iron bars into the jail and looked down, with pity, noting that there were souls, not nearly so shadow-stained, as many who were free. Poor dominated creatures, miserable and pliant in their unconscious servitude. I wanted to tell them how easy it would be to shake off such influence and be free, but not one heard me, although I persisted in calling. One young man, a sailor, turned quickly and listened when I called, but that was all. Although the hour was late, he was sitting, staring out of the window. He turned his face, listened a moment, then sighed and stared on. He was thinking of his home and loved ones across the sea, and I could see the little home, and all of its details. His mind imaged it so perfectly. Then I went down on the wharves, into the ships, and every ship had its individual invisible household, that seemed to belong to it as much as the furniture or even the material with which it was built. These spirits seemed to be much happier in every way than those who confine themselves upon the land. Instead of making objections to my coming among them, they welcomed me more cordially than any other class that I had intruded my presence upon. It was really like a social diversion. They talked freely, explaining many things of interest. They accompanied me out upon the wharves, but in no instance did they enter a ship other than their own. When I was back upon the land, rather a pitiable condition manifested itself to me. There were souls who could not realize that they were dead, and imagined themselves still in the earth life. One was excessively unhappy because of being ignored by friends and loved ones. He could see and hear them, but they could not hear him speak nor see him. Not knowing that he was dead, he could not understand why. Some were groping about, ever feeling, as though they could not see, calling in the most pitiful, pleading way, "Where are you? Where are you?" as though searching for someone they could not find, with the name dearest to them ever on their lips. I realized what a dreadful thing it was to live in the spirit world, recognizing only the physical, ignoring the soul, shutting it out from the growth and development, which is the purpose of the earth existence, and the reason it is given to us. I shuddered and turned away from this condition, to one, if anything, more uncanny. There were souls sleeping, peacefully enough, but just sleeping in the darkness, waiting for what? A call to awaken them, or had they just dropped out, to peacefully await another cycle of time? Those who slept were certainly not unhappy, but just sleeping, even as you and I. I had grown weary of seeing things I did not care to see and turned my eyes away, shutting out all sights, wondering if there was nothing beautiful in the relationship of the seen and unseen. So far, my observations had been rather disappointing, and I felt inclined to go back into my body, if what I had seen was all there was to our invisible relationship. When I would have made this suggestion to Mian, I observed that everything was changed, even the vibrations were different. I could feel the interpenetration of that great electrified current, see the light of it spreading out over everything. Great souls were coming down through the darkness, illuminating as they came down the electrified pathway between the earth and the higher planes. While these beings do not directly interfere with the law of a self-responsibility, which requires each soul to choose for itself between right and wrong, their influence has much to do with the choosing, as well as in the rectifying when the wrong choice has been made, each soul paying the price its wrong choice involves. Almost everyone is, at times, consciously or unconsciously en rapport with these highly evolved souls, as they harmonize with the mundane strata and leave permanent creations in the form of art, literature, music, love, things that make life worthwhile to us. There is a note, within every human being, in tune with the infinite, and we must sometimes feel it when the chord is struck. Sometimes we are conscious of it, when we stand in the presence of a masterpiece of nature or of man. At such times a memory, a chord or strain of music touches within, and stabs us, as it were, with something too deep and exquisite to analyze, leaving a sense of something higher, elusive though it may be, something, somewhere, the soul touch of higher things. There is another class of spirits that seem to belong, in rather a permanent way, to the invisible world about us. They are not highly evolved, and know practically nothing about the world beyond this, but they seem to be helpers and friends to humanity, doing all they can to make the earth life happier. They are very happy and companionable themselves, laughing and playing like children amongst us all the time. Nor are they above playing harmless pranks and jokes on us, which give them much amusement and do not harm us. They are more attracted and helpful to some persons than others, as some seem to attract, while others repel them. Their position does not seem to be an important one, but they keep life from being too burdensomely serious, by adding to it a touch of humor and playfulness. They go down under the earth, which is very easy of access to them, and to a certain extent in the air, confining themselves, however, very closely within the area of human habitation. They have names which are very unlike the earth variety but rather pretty. While I have never attended a spiritualistic séance of any kind, I fancy these spirits would lend themselves quite unreservedly to such occasions, and do all they could to promote communication between the two worlds, but, if they presided over it entirely, there would be little to learn further than the possibility of such communication. The mere fact that such communication is possible, however, is much to the investigator. Then came a phase so tender and beautiful that I looked on almost reverently. It was the tender solicitude of departed loved ones. There was the good, pure spirit mother watching lovingly over her children, especially the little ones whom her transition had left at the mercy of the world. I saw her bending, with hopeful persuasion, over the wayward son, pleading with him who heeded her not. There was the loving, protecting father, helping and comforting the child that needed him most, teaching the one most vulnerable to his influence. Innocent little children were kissing the lips of their sleeping parents, murmuring, "Mama, Papa." There was the loving husband or wife, trying to lighten burdens that weighed heavily on beloved shoulders, and impress his or her presence on the object of solicitude. Friends came to friends, loved ones to loved ones. Eyes looked tenderly into eyes that saw them not, voices went lovingly into ears that heard them not, lips pressed lips that felt them not. Eyes watch us that we cannot see. Lips warn us that we may not kiss. They wait for us and starrily lean towards us from heaven's lattices. The beauty of all this was that these souls were not bound by the magnetism of the earth, but by the ties of love, which transition glorified, making it a pure, holy offering, compared to which love in the earth life is only a shadow. They come and go at will. Yet, I strongly advise those investigating this subject, or anyone who passes into a condition of sensitiveness sufficient to communicate with the invisible, not to call too often to the loved ones on the other side, as they have their lives there, with its attending duties of progression, which demand much of them. The refining of the soul is a delicate process, which interference complicates. If they care to come of their own volition, it is well, let them understand that you are always glad to have them come when they will. I looked upon some beautiful souls, that were held almost earthbound, by the continuous and selfish calling of loved ones still in the earth life, who could not even recognize them when they came, and were regardless of the sacrifices they were causing. When it is possible for our loved ones to come, they will do so without our exacting it. On the other hand, such exactions without the possibility of compliance, leave us open to spirits of deception, who would gladly embrace the opportunity of representing themselves to be the desired one. As we are prone to believe, without question, what our loved ones tell us, we thereby risk putting ourselves in the power of unscrupulous spirits. Those who have learned discrimination run no such risks. It is the beginner who should be careful. Another interesting phase of this wheels within wheels, mundane supermundane conglomeration, was that of persons who had passed out of life with unfinished work, to which they had devoted their lives and talents. They were seeking earnestly for sensitives vulnerable to their influence. When such a receiving station is found, they help and direct, without dominating, the continuance of their achievements and labors, to which is added the knowledge that the evolution to a higher existence supplies one of the greatest forces in Earth's progress. Many of our great men are still living amongst us in this way. Instead of going on the journey of individual progression, they are sacrificing themselves on the altar of progression, of humanity in general, which, in the end, will be a sacrifice more than well made. As I went on taking soul inventories over the city, I came near unto my fiancé, but loyalty placed her white hands over my soul's eyes and I passed on, without the slightest desire of a seeing unseen. Any skeletons that might darken his closet, if there were any, they were, to me, too sacred to violate. This, however, did not apply to his friends, so I vibrated out to the home of one of his business associates and floated through the walls into his presence. He was surrounded by highly evolved beings, who while they loved him very much, made not the slightest objection to my coming as near to him as I desired. He recognized my presence immediately as that of a spirit, an unseen thing, without recognizing who it was. I was shocked to see, suspended over his head, a scroll so nearly unwound that it was hanging by the merest thread, vibrating, quivering, threatening to let go as I looked. It needed no one to tell me that this soul was preparing to raise anchor for other seas. When I would have told him, would have warned him of his coming transition, I perceived that he knew it and was arranging his business affairs accordingly. As I looked upon his soul splendor, I realized how erroneous is the teaching against the spiritual greatness of a rich man. He was rich unquestionably, in material possessions, but richer still in soul achievement and spiritual strength. In the consciousness of his impending transition, I remained for some time, studying this phase of life's drama, and then left the room, wrapped in that odd reverence we feel in the presence of approaching death. The next day I told my fiancé of this coming transition, but he chided me for foolish fancies, but I knew different, a difference which a few weeks verified. When I was again suspended over the city, I bathed listlessly in the moonlight, listening to the moaning of the sea, with all desire for further delving into the soul problem gone. It was all such a tangled web, so many conflicting influences and contradictory manifestations, that I felt it was a problem stupendous beyond my ability to solve, a veritable puzzle. Really, there was no happiness. There was no soul, however shadowed by sin, that sorrow did not outweigh the sin, even in those who combine one virtue with 1,000 crimes. In the midst of my conjectures, I noted a strange shadow-like darkness, creeping upon the earth, enveloping it, and such a wave of tragedy and unhappiness swept over me that I was almost afraid. I turned, with the thought of running back into my body, but the darkness was terrible and I heard a voice saying, "Earth is a giant Gethsemane," and so it seemed, as I waited, wondering. Then I felt the great electrified current and my distress vanished instantly. I could see it spreading out, far out over the face of the earth, dispelling the darkness, consuming the sorrow. Everything was transformed, transfigured, and looking up I saw that a powerhouse, as though it were very near, and great was the illumination between. As I looked, suddenly I beheld a face that we all know, and heard voices crying out, "Behold the second coming of Christ." Slowly this vision faded and I was looking down on the uncovered souls of the city, just as though there had been no insert of agonizing darkness, followed by the light and its wonderful promise. So much had been crowded into such a limited period of time, that there was a sense of confusion and uncertainty in the midst of which I appealed to Mian. "Mian, I want to go back, I am so tired, that fancy is taking liberties with me."
Very well, but to accuse fancy is not to convict it.
"But is Christ coming to earth again?"
Certainly.
He replied impressively.
The reincarnation of this great teacher, by a perfectly natural and recognized law, is soon to be fulfilled.
Further questioning availed little and, when I would have escaped into my body, as into a refuge, I observed beside it a spirit woman crouching furtively, her hands grasping frantically, trying to touch it, her eyes gleaming, her face passionate with eagerness, showing how vitally intent she was upon her purpose whatever it was. I turned to Mian for explanation. "What is she doing?" I asked, mystified.
Trying to appropriate your body during your absence.
He replied evenly, filling me with apprehension, which he allayed by adding,
"But she won't, she cannot even touch it. It is protected against invasions of all kinds."
Looking up she saw us and with a screeching, moaning, cry she slunk away in the darkness. The echoes of her piteous moans wafted back, making even the flesh of my soul creep. I gazed after her intently, even after I could no longer see nor hear her, conjecturing. Then suddenly I was aghast at the revelation, feeling that I had solved the mystery of lost identity, which has so baffled our physicians and scientists. Then I slipped into my body and readjusted myself much more easily than I had the night before. All souls leave their bodies at times, consciously or unconsciously, always during sleep, which is only a matter of the soul, or spirit, leaving the body and going out into the spirit world. When it returns, we wake up. Why do we not bring back the consciousness of such experiences? Really, I do not know. What I do know is that souls are out of their bodies during sleep, for I saw this to be a fact. Some were near their bodies, others were nowhere to be seen, evidently on journeys into higher realms. However, during this time, the bodies are protected against piracy of the earth-magnetized beings, who would be glad to appropriate any body in order to function in the earth life. Because of this splendid system of protection, such cases are fortunately exceedingly rare. It is a very interesting subject nonetheless. I recall reading recently of a case where even the eyes and the stature had changed. The fact is, it is an entirely different soul that inhabits the body. Possibly the former incumbent deserted its earth abode for joys of other realms, leaving it at the mercy of the merciless. Possibly, some disembodied spirit gained strength, superior to the embodied, and simply ejected it. 2. I believe this change has been made by spirits so conversant with the affairs of the person in question that no one ever suspected it. There are cases where persons have changed in character so suddenly and entirely that no accepted theory could reasonably explain them. There are, I believe, instances where the rightful owner has, after a time, regained possession of its earth abode and remembers nothing of the transaction, or so claims. The chances are that he does not. On the other hand, public opinion, the tyrant that makes or mars the average life, would curtail frankness in the matter. This also could be applied to insanity. This, however, was not the only time I saw that woman and heard her wailings. At times while within my body, I felt her disturbing presence, which was always heralded by an unaccountable attack of what we call the blues. Then I strengthened myself against her influence, mentally affirming that she could not affect me in any way, that I was superior to such influence. After that, when she came, there was only the consciousness of her sin-laden and sorrowing presence. I pitied her and spoke to her kindly, asking her to leave me, which she always did immediately, but, as she went, the moaning cries that floated back pierced my heart with a pity that was painful. Later she came and seemed more comforted. Her cries became less and less agonizing, and her presence less disturbing. At last she came. It was a soft, breeze-laden summer's night, as I lay in convalescence. I perceived her presence, and knew she stood beside the bed, but as she had never spoken, I did not even listen. Then she came very near, nearer than she had ever come before, and whispered pleadingly,
"Let me touch your hand, please."
I lifted my hand, that she might take it if she so desired, and as her icy touch came upon it she bent over me and said, with passionate earnestness,
"Go, beautiful soul, through you I have seen the truth, and the light, and I go o'er them blessing you."
With all my weaving of dreams, all the promises that passing behind the veil had given, I had never considered the possibility of helping a soul that had passed beyond the mundane, while I was still in the mundane life, and yet, why not? While still marveling at the revelation, she passed out of my presence and has never since returned.